Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's MisInfo MegaCast episode of Let's Get Vaccinated on HoodMed Chats. And tonight we have the Unbiased Science podcast and two of my favorite members of the Gangstagrass TeamStream who are joining us to discuss how the infodemic and disinformation is ruining our efforts to fight COVID and why anti-vaxxers and the celebs who love them are a danger to us all. My name is Dr. Nisi Hudson. I'm the chair and science director of Hood Medicine Initiative, a collective of scientists, physicians, hackers, and assorted geeks focused on addressing health disparities in Black and Brown communities and reducing the spread of dis and misinformation. Here with us from Hood Medicine, we have advisory board member Charles Centillo, an assistant professor in the Department of Library and Information Science in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. He was a visiting MLK professor at MIT last year, and his research was focused on vulnerable patient populations. He tries to enhance the collection and use of health information to identify and address barriers to care in order to improve health outcomes and reduce cost of care. He advises on public health and data science initiatives here at Hood Medicine. Welcome back, Charles. It's so lovely to see you.
Great to be here.
And of course, we have our resident hacker, Dolio Durant, aka Dolio the Sleuth from the hip hop bluegrass band Gangstagrass, and in his Clark Kent, the lead technical instructor at Zip Code Wilmington. And lastly, but not least, certainly, we have Gangstagrass's brilliant manager and host of Gangstagrass TeamStream every Friday on gangstagrass.tv, Emily Bernstein Messner, better known as Sleeves, who distinguished herself early in her career as a writer at the Washington Post, where she was the first woman to solo author a blog at any major American newspaper. And then after growing increasingly frustrated with news media and being more focused on page views and clicks than on accuracy and depth, she left daily journalism and took refuge in academia. And as I said, she is the manager of the pioneering #1 Billboard bluegrass charting hip hop band, Gangstagrass. So it's so lovely to have you guys here. Some of my favorite band. And of course, we are really thrilled to have Dr. Andrea Love and Dr. Jess Dyer back from the Unbiased Science podcast. Welcome, ladies. Lovely to see you. Dr. Love is an immunologist and a microbiologist, and she currently serves as manager and application scientist at a global biotechnology company. And Dr. Steyer is a public health scientist and health services researcher. She's the CEO of a public health consultancy called Vital Statistics Consulting. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
I thought we might start by talking about what is misinformation. Let's start there because there's a clear sort of difference between disinformation and misinformation. And I wonder, Charles, could you give us just the overview on what that difference is? You're muted, I think. Maybe.
Sure.
Yeah, there you
go. So, and I might add mild information to that as well, if I may. So,
please.
Misinformation is just false. It's just wrong, but it's not necessarily created with negative intent. Whereas disinformation is false information that's specifically created to harm a person or a group. Now, malinformation is information that's based on reality, but it's used to inflict harm on a person, a social group, organization, or even a country. So those are three different terms that are related, but they mean different things. And it's important as we get into this discussion and other discussions to understand the distinctions between them.
And Sleeves, what are some of the ways that you can kind of spot misinformation when you're in the digital space, do you think?
Wow. One of the first things I look for is a source. And that's key, right? Because there are legitimate sources and there are sources that are made to look legitimate but are not. And then honestly, you really want to dive in and see if this is actually corroborated. And a key piece of corroboration is not just all my friends have posted it, but rather, are there other sources? Can you find this on Reuters? Can you find this, at the, in the NIH? Can you actually find the paper that they're talking about in the NIH database? And those kinds of things are pretty key to be able to find an additional source that isn't just something other people are posting. And then I would also look out for adjectives. There are a lot of adjectives that are kind of screaming and just sort of indicate that somebody is trying to push an opinion as opposed to give you actual facts. And if you're in a newsroom for any length of time, one thing that you'll hear is copy editors pulling adjectives out of stories, because you don't actually necessarily need to give people these, it's not appalling, it just is. That sort of thing is a good tip off as well. I'm sure there's other things as well. What would our Unbiased Science podcast folks say they see when they're looking at misinformation?
So, I mean, all of those things, absolutely. I love the distinction of disinformation versus misinformation. A lot of it comes down to, that intent and who it's being disseminated by. And the credibility of the source, right? So Children's Health Defense is a source that we're often sent. And this is the website that's created by RFK Jr. And its sole goal is to masquerade as advocating for children's health when in fact it's an anti-vaccine platform. And so it leads with very clickbait headlines, misinterpretations, and cherry picking of data. But I think the biggest red flags that we try and warn kind of the general public about are outlandish claims or all or nothing claims, things that are making these kind of 100% statements without any degree of uncertainty, because real science, we know, have uncertainty. We're always collecting and reviewing the data. And so people that are making statements like, oh, the spike protein is toxic and it's killing you, not only are there no data to support that, but they're making this blanket generalization, that is its entire intent is really to instill fear and apprehension.
Right. Those sweeping statements, right? Where, oh, this is going to kill you or this is going to save you. It's very rare that we have anything that's going to fall into either of those categories. And sorry, I know we've chatted about this already and we're going to talk more, but mis and disinformation, I think about it as being handed a glass of spoiled milk. So, if it's misinformation, you're going to get sick. The person maybe didn't intend to make you sick, but the result is still that you're sick. Where, of course, with disinformation, the person actually did intend to get you sick. So we're sort of fighting both of those battles now. They're misinformation and disinformation, which I know we're going to chat more about.
For sure. I think one of the biggest things that we are concerned with, all of us here probably, is the spread. We've seen a lot of graphs about spread of disease, but this one is about the spread of lies. This is from a science paper from Visuji and MIT Media Lab group. And so here they're kind of mapping how fast a lie travels in the digital space. And so on the left, where you see like all the more colorful, larger cluster, that's like, mainstream society, journalists, etc. And that's where all of like the credible information kind of lives. And then like on the right, you see this like cluster in red, and that is like this one was stratified on political beliefs. So on the right, that red cluster were basically Trumpers. And what the key takeaway here was how isolated they are. Like all of the little connections indicate tweets and retweets. And so as you can see, they're not interacting much with mainstream society at all in terms of tweeting back and forth. And also, the other thing that they saw was that the lie is just bouncing around and around in that echo chamber. And so they just keep reposting and retweeting false things. And so they were able to like analyze tweets and map all that. And then look at how fast a lie propagated. And spoiler alert, it was way faster than the truth.
It's four times faster.
Yeah.
Yeah. 4 times faster. It's a huge problem. And we see people with these platforms that, propagate these sorts of things, and then it gets, social media obviously is a double-edged sword in that regard. But these falsehoods, whether it's science related or politically related or whatever, they gain traction so much more quickly than legitimate information. And part of that is really the sensational aspect of it, right? Facts and data, unless you're a nerd, are kind of boring for some people. But if you make it inflammatory, you make it sound sensational, then people, they get excited about it and they want to kind of share the word without doing any basic fact checking even. And to your point, Nisi, there was another related study that determined, I can't remember the proportion offhand, but the vast majority of people consuming online news sources are not reading past the headlines. And so media organizations obviously are pay per click these days. And so they're making money by creating those very sensational headlines. But when you dig into the meat of the article, then there's the nuance. And unfortunately, very few people are actually reading the full, body of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, a lot of times that includes the person writing the headline. So sadly,
Yeah.
and you can do yourself a great service by making sure you actually read something before you share it. And there might be something buried far down in the article, or, do some searching to find some additional sources and get some additional context so that maybe you can share the idea of what's actually there as opposed to spreading that inflammatory headline.
I kind of have a question for all of you, but I'm going to start with you, Dolio. But how do you think the spread of misinformation has affected our pandemic response?
I think it slowed down. It slowed it down because of the fact that so many people are hearing so many different conflicting opinions about what they should do. People, because of everything that's happened and the many different sources by which people get their information, they have a significant distrust for what is the quote unquote mainstream media. They always feel like they're being misled. And when you feel like you can't trust anybody, you start trusting the craziest sources, the people that seem to say the most extreme things, get a large following. And then they figure, okay, everybody else is listening to this guy. Maybe I should listen to him too. Or they don't trust, the people who they don't feel have a motive for keeping them safe. So they end up, falling for, all the misinformation or the disinformation.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Sleeves?
Well, we see it just in our day-to-day trying to do shows in this kind of environment, because we're seeing both people who are not wanting to go to shows because they don't think it's safe yet, and that's fair. We're not mad about that, but we are taking a lot of steps to make sure that our shows are as safe as possible. There's a lot of vaccination requirements, negative test requirements, masking requirements, most important of all. And we're also seeing it on the other side. We're seeing people who are angry with us. We saw it in the comments just moments ago. Someone saying, "Well, I had COVID." Someone saying on Facebook, "I had COVID, and this is more disinformation, and I'll never get a vaccine." And so we're losing people at our shows because they don't want to come because there's a vaccination requirement, or they don't want to come because there's a negative test requirement, because they've seen these kinds of and in this case, it's generally disinformation, actually intentionally bad information that they're seeing that's making them make those calls. So yeah, we're seeing that people are making real choices in their real lives based upon some amount of information that maybe it's because their entire social group feels a particular way, and that makes it a lot more likely that they're going to feel that way too. And as a result, all these knock-on effects are happening. They're not going to shows. Also, they're not getting vaccinated. Also, they're going to, maybe bars where it's fine to not be vaccinated, and they're spreading around COVID amongst themselves. And, creating, a worse situation pandemic wise, both because it's being spread around more and also because it's giving more opportunity for mutations. So it's a pretty big set of effects happening there.
Yeah.
I think,
Jess, oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was Jess, you want to go first?
Well, I'm sure we're going to say similar things, and I was, of course, going to defer to you in a sec. But I was just going to say that Andrea and I speak so frequently about the death of expertise. And, early in the pandemic, it seemed like we were all united in this fear of the unknown, this novel virus. And people were listening to the experts. And when I say experts, I'm talking about scientists and immunologists and virologists and epidemiologists and, medical, clinical scientists and so on. And then, because this became so highly politicized and misinformation and disinformation started swirling, we as others have described, we're seeing the real effects of that. We had high hopes for the vaccine. At first, we were all talking, oh, the vaccine, like this was the savior of the pandemic. Of course, we all knew we can't rely solely on vaccinations, right? There have to be other things that we do in tandem. But the vaccine uptake in this country has been so disappointing. I don't know, Andrew, if you know the percentage offhand. And then when you look at the percentage of those who were eligible for boosters, and as was just described, that means that there's so much virus being transmitted in the population. It does give the virus more opportunities to mutate. And then we find ourselves, kind of back where we started, and people are then saying, oh, well, it means that the vaccines don't work. That's not what it means, So, sorry, Andrea, I'm sure you want to jump in here.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, there's a lot of misconceptions on kind of what a trusted source is. We get often attacked, about claims about the mainstream media. And when we're citing sources, we're not citing news outlets. We're citing primary research, peer-reviewed data, and in some instances, preprint data, which is not yet peer-reviewed, but is still primary data. And we obviously always have that caveat that there are limitations to the strength of non-peer-reviewed data. And so I hate getting into this kind of discussion of like mainstream media versus independent media that's spreading the truth, because that's not going to be a productive discussion, because people that already have this pre-existing notion that the mainstream media is not credible, they're not going to be receptive to that. So, we actually talked about this with a podcast episode that's going live on Wednesday with a psychologist about cult mentality and group identity and things like that. And the things that are most successful is really, not getting into a one-on-one debate, but more presenting what the consensus data are, presenting what the body of evidence say. But I think also what's really important is, aside from what the science is saying, is that media literacy is really lacking across our society. People being able to independently vet and read an article and determine, is this credible? Is this supposed to be satire? Does this have sources behind it? And obviously that's a systemic issue that we could probably crawl down a rabbit hole and discuss education and all that sort of stuff. But, I think any way we can kind of equip people to be better consumers of information online, and at least, bring awareness to some of these common red flags, that's ultimately going to benefit. But certainly I think the pandemic has really illuminated these challenges and exacerbated a lot of these problems.
Charles, we've talked a lot about sort of the susceptibility of BIPOC communities to dis and misinformation, whether there is any difference there between sort of disadvantaged communities historically, I guess, disadvantaged communities and mainstream. And I wonder if you could just say a few words about that. Like, is that because there's already justified mistrust of the government and the medical systems that maybe some of these other communities are more willing to just trust things from alternate sources? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and this is an area that I've, I, like many of us, been immersed in the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, as especially as scientific discovery becomes sort of headline news. I think it's important for us to understand our historical context, and I'm no historian, but I do like to understand things and how we got, where are we and how did we get to where we are. And I think one of the issues that we've seen, and as a health equity researcher, I'm primarily working with underrepresented populations in research, racial minority populations, populations who have been, frankly, victims of a lot of medical research and other research that's done in this country and around the world. And one of the things that makes this challenge more difficult to solve, or to at least chip away at, is that for many of us, the distinction between the past and the present isn't so defined. So when we see that the tremendous progress that's been made in this country in terms of both legislatively as well as in other arenas, we see equity being talked about much more and more, and equity and initiatives and resources being spent on equity across various dimensions. However, for many of us, we still see evidence that there is stark inequity in words and actions. So for some populations, the distinction between the past and what we used to do, and those are things that used to happen, and I hear these categorizations and these distinctions made between the past, quote unquote, and the present. For many of us, we come from communities, we come from sort of cultural contexts, we listen to our elders, and we see that the distinction between the past and the present is not so defined. And one of the reasons why the past keeps coming up is because of this opacity between the past and the present. And I like to say, those who don't understand their history will be punished by it. And many of us see current events in the context of historical events and don't see such a distinction between the past and the present. So when I run into, both formally and informally, perceptions and beliefs that, and I use this terminology intentionally, and I've used this in my studies as I've worked with various participants over the years, beliefs or perceptions that aren't consistent with my understanding of the empirical science. Not that it's wrong, not that it's reflective of someone who isn't a deep enough thinker, and not to use our medical or our educational credentials as a weapon, but to meet people where they are, and worry more and be focused more on their beliefs rather than our own, and figure out, okay, well, where does that come from? And do more listening than talking. And I think many of us in the scientific community tend to take on a persona that we know a lot more than other people do. And those of us who do science, social science or bench science, understand that there's a whole lot we don't understand. And I think that if we can address that and bring that up and disclose that and admit to that the more we learn, the less we're sure in many instances, I think that we can close the chasm between those of us who have the fancy letters and the fancy positions and those who may not have access to the same information that we do. So in summary, the distinction between the past and the present is not so defined for many communities, as we see the past repeat itself. And for many of us in the scientific community, we get too quick to label things right or wrong. And there's just so much that's left to learn. And the pandemic has really revealed that as science evolves, our understanding evolves. And we all don't evolve at the same pace.
Yeah. And like, in terms of like, I since we've started doing this, I can't help but look at things from a lens of like, catering to or targeting a Black audience versus targeting like more, I don't know, mainstream, whatever you want to call it, American white audience, whatever euphemism we're using. And I feel like when I'm looking at like the threads of disinformation that are coming out of both completely disparate communities, they're similar, like, meaning like the things that they believe, the 5G, the mark of the devil, all of the ridiculousness. The threads are similar, but the way they spread and the reasons they take root are different, and their bizarreness is baffling. But I mean, Dolia, we've talked about this a lot in terms of like why this information gets propagated in our communities versus in the mainstream. Like, what are your thoughts like on that?
I have mixed mixed opinions on that. Part of it is that there's people that profit off of the fact that there's people that can profit off of the misinformation. The other is that there is an agenda at hand. A lot of the misinformation I find in certain groups is more like is the opinion that things like vaccinations and are intended to cause harm, but I feel like it should also inspire a bit of skepticism about whether or not they need to protect themselves by masking and social distancing. I'm like, if you're not going to vaccinate, at the very least protect yourself. But if there indeed was a conspiracy to do harm with a vaccination, there still exists a very real pandemic. But if there is indeed an agenda, I feel like the conspiracy is to misinform and tell people not to vaccinate and protect themselves. Because if the intention is to do harm, then the end result is you not protecting yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, the harm is done.
Yeah.
And as a person who's had to attend way too many funerals in the past 2 years, with way too many numbers on my phone that I cannot call anymore due to this current pandemic, it's something I can't stand for.
Mm.
Now,
I
know I'm a white person, so there are obviously things that I can't speak to, but I do think that there is the elephant in the room that there is medical racism. There has been, a history of systemic marginalization of populations of color. So there is, I think, as you said, Nisi, the underlying reasons for why people are skeptical vary depending on demographics and culture and social organization and things like that. And so you have people that, have some legitimate reasons to be wary and apprehensive and all of that. But I think, in those instances, particularly if we're talking about communities of color who we know are disproportionately affected, not necessarily just because of the virus itself, but also because of healthcare access and equity and all of those sorts of things, that we need trusted members in those communities to come out and help kind of break down those barriers, break down that stigma, break down that apprehension. And, so I think that's a huge challenge. I know Jess and myself, we try to discuss issues of, abuse of people during medical research throughout history. So of course we talked about Tuskegee, we talked about, Nazi experimentation, and a lot of those things are steeped in bigotry and xenophobia and all of that. So I think we have to be candid about those things, so that people don't think we're kind of pulling the wool over their head. But I think, there's a way to overcome that. And so that we can continue to protect, people, particularly in these populations that have lower rates of vaccine uptake and are seeing disproportionately high poor COVID outcomes.
Yeah. I think we should probably get into a little bit about who's spreading it because this is really kind of important in that sense too. I think, you know, in BIPOC communities, a lot of people are sort of getting their information largely from pop culture. A lot of celebrities, Clubhouse is a cesspool of just ludicrous conspiracy theories. It's really baffling and really dangerous. It's scary almost. It's just like there's so many rooms in Clubhouse that are moderated by Black people, full of Black people. I'm talking about hundreds of people, and just spouting some of the most absurd things about the pandemic that I've ever heard in my life. But we know that there are bad actors too. Like there are concerted like disinformation campaigns online targeting Black communities. Some that were just reported on recently, and I will drop that link in the chat, where they were reporting that like Black people couldn't die from COVID and the virus was man-made and we should be taking herbal remedies and the 5G. And these are all of the main foundational strains of disinformation that Black people often regurgitate. And that was actually a concerted like campaign of disinformation that was coordinated, much like the Russia thing with Trump. And then you also have like the Nation of Islam and American Descendants of Slavery, or ADOS, who are pushing some very harmful nationalistic, fascist, anti-immigrant propaganda on top of, which is already problematic, but also putting out a lot of disinformation and just harmful information about the pandemic. And I don't know how we really curb that. I mean, Charles, we've talked a lot about that, about how do we like, first we have to identify where is it coming from? What are the sources? How is it spreading? But my goodness, sometimes when I log into Clubhouse, I think I give up because I don't know. I don't even know where to begin. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just add. I just think that the key, not necessarily to suggest that it's easy, or that there's necessarily a stop to it, right? Because these sources are going to keep cropping up. But I think if we can better target, okay, where are these conduits to misinformation and malinformation? Where are they? Is it Clubhouse? Is it something else? And then what to do to combat it. And I think the source, as we talked about, when we evaluate information, particularly online, we, whether we're paying attention to it or not, we're making some assessment of its credibility based on the source or our understanding of the source. And if we can see where those big sources are, where that information is getting to a lot of people, then you can begin to sort of target and try to combat it.
Yeah.
It's a huge issue and it's growing.
Speaking of bad acts, okay.
I was going to say, I think it's compounded by the fact that when you try and debunk these bad actors, then you're targeted as trying to silence the truth speakers. And, there are a certain population of people that are receptive, or the ones that say they want to hear both sides and, make their own judgment. And in reality, there isn't a two-side situation to what the data say and what sort of fallacies are being promoted. And so, you enter this conversation, in a lose-lose scenario. And so I don't have a solution to how you can get through to kind of that one group that really have their heels dug in and are just really resistant to listening to anything that's born out of consensus.
Yeah.
And we spend so much of our energy on Unbiased Science debunking so many of these claims that have gone viral and some of these major characters that I know, we're going to chat about some of them, but obviously Joe Rogan keeps coming up and some of the guests who he's had on his podcast. What's really problematic is when you have folks who have an MD or a PhD who I feel they do weaponize their credentials, and they are, for whatever reason, and I don't have an explanation for it, but some potential explanations for why they seem to have turned their back on science, whether it be for fame or for money. So many of them are pushing their own supplements or cures, and then they get lauded as these brave whistleblowers, when in fact, what they're spewing is misinformation. And so what we do, and it takes so much time and energy to do so, is to sort of pick apart their claims. And what we try to do is, we're debunking the science of it. This is incorrect because, and then we'll cite our sources and the data. But the problem is, a lot of times people don't really care. When we get super technical and the science debunk, that often isn't effective. And I, obviously, as Andrea said, we don't have the answer, but this is a real problem.
Speaking of which, you guys just recently made a post debunking all of the crap that Dr. Robert Malone, who ought to be ashamed. Whoever Dr. Robert Malone is, you just ought to be ashamed. But why don't you guys tell us a little bit about the scenario and what it was there?
Goodness.
Yeah.
So we actually did a previous debunk on Peter McCullough, who was a guest on Joe Rogan's podcast just prior to Robert Malone. And that one seemed to be, relatively popular. I mean, he said a lot of the same claims that, no one's focusing on treatment and hydroxychloroquine works, but he also went down the conspiracy theory hole, and he started slinging that term mass formation psychosis, which we actually spoke to a psychologist, and it has no meaning. It's a made up term. It does not mean anything. And, nobody's in a trance or hypnotized about vaccination effectiveness. But we get sent these because Rogan has so many viewers. He has millions of listeners and people that watch his YouTube channels. And so Robert Malone has kind of become this figurehead for the anti-vaccine movement, touting himself as the inventor of the mRNA vaccine initially. And then he walked it back and said he was the inventor of the technology. And then if you actually look at it, he was a co-author on a paper in the 80s that was looking at some biological methods to deliver mRNA to cells, while he was trying to get into graduate school, and he ended up quitting his PhD program. And so then he's kind of had this, career of doing various consultancy work with pharmaceutical companies. And early in the pandemic, he was trying to repurpose famotidine, which is acid reflux medication, to see if it worked against the virus, and that didn't pan out. And then he tried to take credit for the vaccine, and then that didn't pan out. And so then he took to making all of these false claims about the harm of the vaccine. And so it seemed like he is salty about the fact that he wasn't given enough credit for his contribution decades and decades ago. It seems that, he's got, he was hoping for some financial incentives because of his contributions to that paper decades and decades ago. But since he didn't get that, now he's looking for financial incentives by being this figurehead for these podcasts and making money from these appearances. But he's vaccinated with an mRNA vaccine. His wife even, claimed credit for it on her Facebook, which is still publicly available. So anyway, so we took to, debunking. We listened to the whole podcast episode. One of our interns helped me kind of tease apart all of the claims, and she listened to it several times. So, praise her for, I wanted to rip my ears off after the first round. But basically we did a line by line, debunk of, this is the statement he made, this is why it's false. And he, he has an MD and he has some clinical immunology experience. And so he slings around science jargon that make him sound credible and knowledgeable. And to the general public, he can make these terms sound relevant and scary. And when in reality, they're not relevant. And he's kind of manipulating the jargon to appeal to authority. And so, we tried to address that, that post was removed. We got it restored, of course. That kind of provided some of the foundation for that open letter to Spotify, which was basically a fact check and, asked Spotify to have a little bit more accountability on policing misinformation. None of the people on that letter asked him to be silenced or removed, which, contrary to people who didn't read the letter, that's not what we said. But we want there to be oversight. They have a responsibility in being a platform for, as Charles said, this conduit. And people need to own that responsibility. And his podcasts and the guests that he has on, it is potentially killing people, right? They're taking these unproven or disproven treatments instead of getting vaccinated. They're taking hydroxychloroquine, or they're taking ivermectin, or, Joe Rogan went on and told young adults that they didn't need to get vaccinated because they were healthy. And, all of that has been disproven by science at this point.
And they're so clever. They focus on certain things that they know are going to induce so much fear, things around infertility in particular, and all that stuff. So that's been very frustrating. And as Andrea said, we did sign this letter. There's been a ton of pushback. We have just to throw it out there, we've received really intense threats of sexual violence, assault, death threats. These are very, very angry people, and it's very tough to know, is there a way to get through to them? That's something that Andrea and I go back and forth all the time. Is it futile? Is there just a small percentage of people who can't be reached? So I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
I don't either, but it is troubling. Dr. Peter Hotez, we have him on a lot, and we've inherited a lot of his trolls, and he's like legit getting like death threats every other day. I don't even know.
He was like seriously doxxed a while back.
Yeah. And it's just like, there's people like the woman in Florida where they came to her house, and like, it's just like, what are you doing? It's bad enough that you're going to kill us all with your, stubbornness about the vaccine. Like, you're already putting lives in danger. Like, I don't understand people who make death threats. Like, go take that to a mirror somewhere.
Yeah. And it's, it's so, the cognitive dissonance, and the hypocrisy is really, it's on full display in these instances. We get accused all the time of being paid shills, and we're being paid off by mainstream media or the government or whoever, and they chant this follow the money, but then they forget that Joe Rogan has $100 million contract to have controversial people on because it boosts listenership, because people are like, oh man, I I heard this mind-blowing, person who's speaking the truth. And then, he makes inflammatory Instagram posts like, this is going to get taken down soon, so you better tune in now. And, he does that because he knows that he is spreading misinformation. And whether or not he personally believes it, I think at this point is irrelevant, because he's become the platform for spreading this to people who do believe it. And it's dangerous.
Yeah. Sleeves and I were talking the other day about how anti-vax propaganda is strong AF, and just all of the crazy things that people will do once they have ingested that. And so we're seeing like protests in Europe against vaccine mandates for the Vax Pass, and protests here still about everything. And I wanted you to like talk a little bit about what we were saying about like populism and protesting against your own self-interests and all that.
Well, this is, I think, the key thing here, and the amazing thing that is unsurprising and yet sad nonetheless, is that it's happening in the chats of this podcast right now. It's happening right now.
She gonna call him out.
While people are listening to actual facts, they are creating an echo chamber of their own in the comments, reinforcing each other as they make these frankly unfounded claims. And they feel that these things are accurate for a couple of reasons. One is that the more people who are in their social group, as I talked a little bit about before, the more people who are in their family, the more people who are on their Facebook feed who are posting these things, the more they're seeing it. And the echo chamber is real. The more it echoes, the more you see the same thing, the more you think that that is actually accurate. And another thing that's happening, and I think this is something that we need to be thinking about as we try to figure out how to get out of this cycle of disinformation and malinformation, is that once people say something out loud, once people make a statement, they are more committed to it than they were before they said it out loud. And especially if they make a commitment in public, they are more committed to it than they were when they had not actually voiced that commitment yet. And if you think about it, you've seen this before. There's tons of evidence of this, right? This is one of the big pieces of advice for people who are dieting. For example, if you say, or who are trying to quit smoking, for example, if you go to everybody in your office and you like write a little note that says, I will never smoke another cigarette, and you leave that note on the desk of everybody at your office, you're a lot more likely to have success with quitting. It turns out, science shows this, and people's individual experience shows this, than if you just think, I'm going to quit smoking, and then you try to quit smoking. So it's that public commitment that's even more forceful than just saying something out loud to yourself, which is even more forceful than just thinking it. And there is tons of science on this. There's great studies. I think this one's out of Canada, where they looked at people's behavior at a horse race track and asked them how confident they were in a particular horse's chances before they made the bet. And then they asked them again after they made the bet. And they were way more confident after they made the bet that this horse was going to win. Not because anything about the circumstances of the race had changed, not because they had any more information, but because they had made a commitment to that horse winning. And therefore it felt more true to them and more likely to them. So it's this commitment, this public commitment, especially, and then the consistency that people feel they have to have after that. There's a huge advantage in our society to being consistent. People love consistency. They want you to, you make a statement and you stick to it. And that's why Joe Rogan is very, very unlikely to come back and say, oh, you know what, my bad, I was wrong. And that's why these people who have come out in favor of all kinds of crazy, anti-worming medications and, hydroxychloroquine and folks who have come out in favor of those cures are not likely to change their minds, not because they can't understand the science, but because they have made a public commitment. And that I think is why we're in a bigger bunch of trouble now than we were before the internet, before Facebook, before Twitter and whatnot, because everybody has that platform where they are making public statements, public commitments all the time. And once you've shared that piece of disinformation, even if you then come upon good information, even if your doctor who you've trusted for years tells you, wow, that's just super wrong, man. You really got that wrong. You should tell everybody that that's wrong. You're highly unlikely to then go back and change what you've said about it. So that's putting us in a very, very serious situation as far as combating disinformation. And that's why it's so powerful, because people, as soon as they've said it, they are committed to it, and they're not very likely to change, and they're going to keep purveying that mis and disinformation.
And in some ways that anti-vaccine rhetoric becomes a very strong part of that group identity, right? It becomes part of them as opposed to simply a belief that they have. And so walking away from that now is like breaking off a piece of their persona essentially. And so it can be very, very hard to, pair those apart.
My husband's an ER doc, and he said, he's obviously come across a lot of characters and people who've responded very differently, and there's all kinds of interesting stuff that we could talk about there. The cognitive dissonance of people who will run to the hospital, to the physicians who begged them to get the vaccines, suddenly trusting them once they get sick, and then taking all of the non-FDA approved monoclonal antibody treatments and Pavloxid, who's made by Pfizer and this and that. But what was my point in saying that? He's had people, on their deathbeds, just, nope, it's not real, and so, yeah, it's just so ingrained in them. It's such a part of their identity that some will literally hold on to it until they die. Very
well,
serious.
and
I literally wonder if, like, when they get to the pearly gates, is like St. Peter like, we tried to tell your ass. Like, how does that work to your dying breath?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Well, something that Jess's husband said, recently that I think resonates with a lot of people is, he'll have someone come into the emergency department and, he'll ask why they're there, and it's a COVID patient and they're like, well, I'm sick. And he's like, yeah, but why are you here, for treatment, right? And then it gets to, oh, well, I trust you. And so it's, okay, so you trust me to treat you when you're sick, but why are you not trusting me when I tell you to get the vaccine to prevent the illness in the first place? And I found that particular, insight, it really, it's unfortunate that it takes a person having to go to the hospital before it clicks like that. But, I hope that there are ways, and obviously Jess and myself hate to use an appeal to emotion, but sometimes that has to be interwoven with the data, because there are people that it really only resonates when there's that emotional component involved.
It's a great point about how people often don't realize how serious this is until they're in the hospital. And we do have comments in the comment sections talking about, well, I had COVID and it wasn't bad at all. Well, the problem is that while it's not bad for a lot of people, it's also killing a lot of people, and not just the most vulnerable people. It's not really as predictable as we would like it to be who exactly is getting killed. And that's why, some people will change their minds on their deathbed. My cousin's mother-in-law convinced her finally to get the vaccine. It didn't matter that my cousin has medical professionals in her family who told her, whom she's trusted over many years, who told her to get the vaccine. She wasn't going to do it until her mother-in-law on her deathbed said, this is the worst way to die. Get your vaccine. Please get your vaccine, get the kids vaccinated, because that was what it took. But that's not necessarily even going to work for everybody. And it's so interesting too, I'm also seeing a lot of comments about don't trust big pharma. But I wonder how many of the people who are saying that take some form of antidepressant, or, take oxycodone when they're in pain. And that, that's big pharma too. I personally don't actually trust big pharma, generally speaking. I think that, there's a lot of stuff out there that creates resistant strains. And, there's a lot of things that we do have to be really careful about. But when it comes to a global pandemic where I can teach my immune system something with an injection that my immune system otherwise would have to learn the hard way, I'm going to take that. I'm going to make that choice to teach my immune system the easy way instead of the hard way. Whatever side effects I might get from a vaccine, I am much more concerned about the long-term effects of COVID, about the heart damage that's caused from it, about the other organ damage that's caused from it, about long-term problems with blood clots. There's so many reasons to say, okay, maybe I don't trust big pharma as a general matter, but in this particular case, I'm going to go ahead and get that vaccine because the alternative is so much worse.
Well, and I think it's also important to, I think, something, so I work, we collaborate with pharmaceutical companies for a variety of research projects. So there's a big difference between the pharma organization and the CEO and the, C-suite executives and the scientists that are doing the research. And so I think a lot of people don't understand the nuance behind that. I mean, scientists are just people that are trying to answer the unanswered questions. And whether they happen to start in academia or they're in biotech like I am, or if they're in pharmaceutical research, that's kind of the common goal. And we get those arguments about, there were some underhanded dealings about some other unrelated product over the years. I mean, there are literally underhanded dealings with every single major organization on the planet, pharmaceutical, airline, hotel, otherwise. I mean, you can't use that. That's a red herring. You're trying to distract from the conversation at hand. But I mean, if you want to talk about money and the profits of pharmaceutical companies, the companies that or the products that they're making money on are things that people are taking chronically, consecutively over years, things for atherosclerosis, high blood pressure, COPD, Prozac, your antidepressants, you've got your Viagra folks. I mean, those are the things that those companies are making money in. There's not actually that much profit in vaccine research and manufacturing because the R&D is very money intensive. And once you get a vaccine, yes, there are multiple doses, and pretty much every vaccine on the planet is a multi-dose vaccine. So let's not forget that. But you're not taking that daily for the rest of your life like you are with other medications. And then you get into the realm of, they don't trust Pfizer, but they'll take Paxlovid, which is also manufactured by Pfizer, once they actually develop COVID-19.
Yeah,
exactly. I have a question for Charles about communicating, not just about misinformation and disinformation, but about a lack of information. So, for example, we're talking about antivirals. We, of course, had years of experience with antibacterials and seeing that while, antibacterials have a very important place in medicine, if they're overprescribed, you end up creating resistant strains. You have the same potential problem with antivirals, in particular, an antiviral that maybe works by attempting to mutate the virus out of dangerousness. So we have these this kind of lack of understanding about how antivirals, antibacterials work. We also have just in general, lack of understanding about how germs spread, about what's happening in the air, about what's coming out of your mouth, about how all of that works. How do you address not just the disinformation, not just the misinformation, but just a lack of information, a sort of black hole in some people's minds around these pieces of science?
Yeah, that's been a question that's been around long before COVID too, right? Is to try to inform patients or inform populations so that they can be more engaged with their care. In general, a more engaged patient shows better outcomes. Engaged just means that they're asking questions, that they're bringing information that they might have found to their consultations, to their providers, and engaging in a conversation versus having it be a more one-way interaction. It's an ongoing challenge. I do tend to try to figure out where beliefs come from, and if it's just a lack of information, then that is one approach to communicating health information. Whereas if it's a perception or belief that, again, isn't consistent with what the empirical science says, there might be another approach. So part of the nuance is that it might very much be dependent on that individual's milieu and how they arrived at that, who told them that, where did they get it from, where did they come to get these beliefs. And unfortunately, many PSAs can't incorporate all of that individually. So like a lot of most politics is local, public health has become very local, and you have individuals in communities and even counties that show the I was just looking at some articles about vaccination rates, and one of the largest predictors of vaccination rate in the county is political partisanship, which probably doesn't surprise us given what we do, but there's these foundational sort of perceptions that people come into this information with, and it's really difficult to discern between simply not knowing or simply believing something because it's been consistent with whatever their own belief sort of circles say that they should believe. So the good news, though, is that there's a wide corpus of health communication literature and science that is grounded in how to communicate health information to various communities. And I won't be able to synthesize it all for the purpose of this answer, but the foundational principles are rooted in trying to meet people where they are and figuring out, okay, who are you targeting, right? What's the population that you want to deliver information to, and what's their belief system? What is going to be a trusted source for them? And where might some of the historical context take them in terms of certain beliefs? I remember recently I was actually on a flight recently, and I saw someone wiping down the areas of the plane on the seat, and I was just thinking to myself, I remember doing that as well early in the pandemic, because we thought, well, we didn't know how this virus was transmitted. And now we know that it's primarily airborne, and yet people are wiping down surfaces. But my first thought wasn't, hey, this is a mouth-breathing knuckle dragger that doesn't know any better, because that's not a terribly useful way to communicate with anyone. But just thinking about, okay, I wonder where that comes from. And I wonder what their actions and their belief systems might be congruent in some areas and not in others. Maybe they're just doing that out of habit, or maybe they're doing that out of some belief system. So I guess in a long-winded way, I'm trying to say that meeting people where they are and doing more listening, and that rather than labeling, is a good place to start to try to parse out, well, who do you want to communicate to, and what do you want to communicate to them?
I know. Maybe they're wiping down the seat because people are nasty.
Gross, disgusting,
Exactly.
terrible.
Yeah, I've seen people wipe the boogers off their nose and put their hands right back on their armrest.
So terrible.
That wasn't my first thought, but yes.
I'm saying that because
I
I'm one of
agree
those.
with
I'm one of those people. As soon as I get on the plane, I'm like wiping everything down, because I know once I get in there, I'm like, I don't want to like just take somebody else's boogers and stick them in my eye.
So gross.
Sorry.
And yet so true. And
Now we're sharing.
one of the questions we wanted to address tonight is, what do we owe to each other? Hygiene, basic personal hygiene, you guys.
Basic
That's one of
hygiene.
the things we owe to each other. In terms of like messaging, I just want to like make the point. First, I'm going to show this comment because I'm just like, John Coster, whoever you are, you totally get me, because COVID will go away when it gets sick of us. That's my praxis. Like, I think a lot of times when you're fighting with people who have subscribed to a particular thread of mis or disinformation, it's hard to get them out of the frame of thinking about what other people are saying, what other people are purveying. What does the government say? What does this person say? I'm not even worried about the human species. I need people to refocus on the virus. It doesn't care about your political beliefs or whether you think science is a belief system. It'll go away when it gets sick of us. Period. Hashtag done with COVID. Hashtag COVID's not done with you. And it'll let you know when it is. So thank you, John, because that is exactly how I feel. But you know, the Unbiased Science Pod, we've done a couple of little like collaborative graphics, and we need to do some more. And we may be some of the best to ever do it, but we certainly weren't the first. We have a bunch of like old graphics that we wanted to show people, just to let you know that unlike COVID, we don't learn and adapt. Period. This is from the Red Cross. We could have made this last week. public notice. I don't know if people took these more seriously back in the day, or if because this one is like, don't go to the movies, don't go to church. Trying to tell people that now, and they're having a fit in the comments. And then, even back then, they were trying to demonstrate to people, guess what? You spit in each other's mouths when you talk. Like, I literally just leaked on my keyboard when I said that. So that's like case in point. So, and so it's like, what do we have to do? Like, we did this almost 100 years ago. So are we evolutionarily inferior to COVID? Because we're not learning and adapting, obviously, at a rate that COVID is. I don't know.
It's a topic that I discuss at length, I think. I mean, obviously there's a lot of sociological factors at play here. Social media has made it so that anybody can have a voice, a platform, an opinion, whether it's unfounded or not, whether it's backed by data or not. And we have the Dunning-Kruger effect in full force, where many of the loudest critics are the least knowledgeable about the topic with which they're talking about. I mean, we see that when we talk about all sorts of science things, whether it's vaccines or GMOs and genetic engineering or organic produce or climate change. And when social media enables you to communicate with people around the world in real time, it makes that challenge, beyond just a community effort, where, grassroots is really where the work is going to be done. But, if the actions of grassroots efforts are being combated or fought against by this kind of collective, sphere of social media, it becomes really challenging to kind of, advocate for the efficacy, the safety, the data behind something like vaccine.
I guess Charles was feeling a little bit left out here, so I'm just going to go ahead and share his quote really quick as well. It's a timely one, and
I read that early in the pandemic. I ran across that one.
When you mix science with politics, you get politics. So there you go. Very scientific. But Charles, I guess I want to start with you I wanted to ask everyone sort of what your why is. We've obviously all committed to trying to curb the spread of mis and disinformation and trying to, advocate for our communities. What does this mean to you? Why did you want to take this on? Begin that opinion.
This and thanks for the question. The knowing the why is usually where the interesting insights lie. For me, this is just an extension of the health equity work I've been doing for, I don't know, over a decade now. So when the pandemic first came upon us back in March 2020, I anticipated that the same factors that we know are in place, these social determinants of health that are drivers of health inequities, are still in place and may actually be drivers of COVID inequities. And that turned out to be the case. Among the social determinants of health are perceptions and beliefs, and those are influenced by the information around us and where it comes from. So for me, although mis, and disinformation and information credibility is a huge part of information science, where I did my doctoral training, I didn't necessarily focus on that in my health equity work. However, when just like I didn't necessarily focus on infectious diseases beyond some HIV work early on in my work, but the targeting of communities that I was already working with in terms of trying to find drivers and ways to address barriers to care for common chronic conditions like diabetes and chronic kidney disease and cancer, I thought, well, here's an area that is ripe for study. where I can bring what I can to it. And lo and behold, obviously, we're here now. The propagation and the targeting, which is particularly problematic, but not just the propagation, but targeting of mis and malinformation specifically to communities of color was something that um, was not going to be ignored by me. And I can do what I can, despite not being focused on um, sort of information credibility in my training. So that's really part of the why. For me, it's just an extension of uh, the health equity work that I have been involved with other super talented, committed people over the past decade plus.
What about you, Jess and Andrea? Why don't you tell us about your why? Why did you decide to make yourselves targets for the good of society?
So it started really early on in the pandemic. Folks were reaching out to me. They knew I had a doctorate in some field that was relevant, to health research, and noticed that Andrea was getting the same types of questions. And so we just joined forces and figured, okay, let's have one centralized repository of information. For me, and I don't want to speak for you, Andrea, I know you'll chime in here in a sec, it has a lot to do with making science accessible for everyone, and taking, we did go to school and train for many years, and there are many complex concepts. And so taking those concepts and translating them for the layperson, that's the main goal. But I'd like to add that for me, I don't want to have a scientific echo chamber either. I don't only want to talk to people who are like-minded and who are already, I hate to even say, but, pro-science, or who are interested in science or educated in science, whatever it may be. We want to reach everyone, people who might have some mistrust of science. We want to serve as a trusted source, a go-to for all people. And that really, at least, I'm finding it increasingly difficult to do as this becomes even more and more politicized. It's like everything we say is immediately met with vitriol. But that's my why. Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, since I was 7 years old, I knew I was going to study infectious disease immunology. So, I've always been fascinated with, why we get sick, what are the different types of pathogens, the nuance behind it, how the technological advancements we have, and, obviously as I got deeper and deeper into the science, into the field, it becomes very apparent that there are these information silos, and the general public does not know the difference between a virus or a bacteria or a parasite, or how an antibiotic works versus an antiviral versus a vaccine. But it's even more than that. It's a lot of these kind of basic science concepts, like why RNA is not interacting with DNA, kind of molecular biology things, why GMOs are not harmful. And so it became this kind of fashion to kind of marry my love and passion of science with wanting to educate people, in a more broad context. And exactly as Jess said, I think the pandemic was really the impetus behind it, but we have been chatting about, dispelling myths and misconceptions about all sorts of science and health related topics. And, we don't shy away from controversy. We are going to challenge people's biases. We had a podcast episode on homeopathy. We had a podcast episode on chiropractic, and everything is evidence-based. And, some people who follow us for our vaccine content are, angry that, we talked about the lack of data behind chiropractic treatment. And so, there's going to be something for everybody, but I think, for me, I always want to be learning. I want to be learning how to engage with people better. I want to be learning how to educate people better. And I want to help other people consume information better. I think all of us who are trained as scientists really have an obligation for society to do that.
I love that. I guess I'll start with you, Sleeves. I know that you guys meaning Gangstagrass, aka of AGT fame. I know you guys have done a lot, like you said. You mask up at the shows, you have testing and vaccination requirements, etc. But what was it like for you guys? Like, I know that you've committed to using your platform as well to educate your fans, but can you tell me a little bit about why you guys were committed so strongly to that?
Go ahead, Dol.
Yeah.
Talk a little. I'd love to talk about
Well,
my personal commitment.
Yeah. First, first of all, the motivation is selfish and self-interest on our part, because a lot of us, most of us, actually have young children. I am, and at least a couple of us are also, caring for elderly relatives. I have a multi-generational household, people who are at risk. So the motivation behind taking the action that we've done, as far as preventative measures, as far as like preventing us bringing home something to our families. The other thing is that the way that we engage with our fan base is less as regarding them as fans, but more regarding them as supporters. These are people who've kept our boat afloat over the years, but they are also fall within this multi-generational span. People of all ages or all walks of life. We actually generally care about these people because we know most of them. So we try to do everything we can to also ensure their safety. The last thing we want is for us to have some sort of a gathering where now you got a new variant that they're naming after Gangstagrass.
Right. We do not want that to happen.
And Sleeves, could you touch on maybe just a little bit, sort of the dichotomy between like losing like some of your Trumper fans who don't want to wear a mask at shows and harass you guys when they see you with your masks on, and like balancing that with like, because you guys have a really interesting connection to your audience. The hip hop bluegrass connection is really this bridge that brings together like some pretty disparate audiences. And how do you get them to understand that you're just trying to keep them safe when you get the stubborn ones?
That is such a great question, Nisi, and it's a question that we roll around in our meetings. I mean, as recently as last week, we were talking about this in our meetings. It has been an ongoing conversation because this is a quintessentially American band. We cover the bluegrass, we cover the hip hop, we cover the country, and we cover the rap, and and it's more than that too. And as Dolia was saying, we have grandparents who bring their grandkids to the shows, and we have kids who bring their parents and grandparents to the shows. And
people bring their babies to our shows.
People bring their babies. We sell Gangstagrass onesies. Like, that's how young our fans can be. We really have fans of every possible demographic. And what we find is that yes, we have some fans who will refuse to come to the shows because we have too many precautions in place. And we have some fans who will refuse to come to the shows because they think it's not possible to have enough precautions in place. But we've gotten more and more, especially with the increased transmissibility of Omicron, but just in general over the course of the time, we locked down touring. We stopped touring before I think any band I know. We canceled a lot of shows real fast. We decided not to tour at certain times of the year. Like early last year, we decided January 2022 was a time we were not going to book any shows for, because we felt like there was too high of a chance that it was going to be too dangerous at that time. So we've made a lot of affirmative choices to make sure that we keep ourselves, that we keep, everybody's kids, Dolio's parents-in-law, to keep everybody as safe as we possibly can. But I want to say sort of one more thing about that, because I'm seeing a lot in the comments about the mainstream media and stuff like that. And remember, I'm a person who comes from that background. And again, I'm personally super pro-America, with all its flaws, all its historical flaws, all of its current flaws. I am extremely pro-American because I feel like our system of government allows people to have a voice and allows the kind of freedom of speech that a lot of people in the comments are saying is so important. It is important. And I got into journalism because I wanted to help bring about a more fully informed electorate, because I looked at politics and I saw that the way that political parties were getting support and getting money was by scaring people, by instilling fear in people. And I wanted to make sure that people had as much information, real information, good information as possible. But it turns out that the mainstream media is not perfect. And it is a problem because we need that kind of informed electorate. We need open discussion and thoughtfulness, and open discussion without death threats and anger, but just real good quality discussion and quality information, or our democracy doesn't work. The only way that we can make it work is by having this kind of information and these kinds of discussions open, even with the people in the comments who are creating their own echo chamber. Hopefully they've heard something that we've said. Hopefully, there have been some other people in the comments who got to them. And, the mainstream media, part of why it has become less and less reliable is because what the 24-hour news cycle used to mean at a daily newspaper was you have 24 hours to get your story right, and maybe longer, right? For an investigative piece, days, weeks. But what the 24-hour news cycle means now is that there's deadline pressure all the time. And these journalists, even the ones that we think that we can trust, are in a situation where they are under pressure to be constantly putting new stories in, to get that story up on the website as quickly as possible. And because there's less money coming in, there have been buyouts and less hiring, and layers of editing has gone away as well. So that's why it's incumbent upon each person. People in the comments are talking about do your own research. It is incumbent upon you to do your own research, but you have to be careful about what your sources are. Go directly to those scientific papers in the NIH databases, in PubMed. Go directly to your doctor and the actual real experts. Go directly to the scientific literature and don't just trust what somebody else is saying about it, because even those most trusted journalists have limited time and under a lot of pressures and aren't necessarily reading that whole paper. You can go and read that entire scientific paper, and if you have questions about it, you can ask your doctor, you can ask real scientists about it. You can bring those questions to people like the Unbiased Science podcast. You can ask us on our Gangstagrass.tv team streams, and we'll check stuff out with you. But that's what we need in order for this country and for our world to work, right? We need that information. We need that exchange. We need that free flow of ideas. And as Charles was saying, we need to look at each individual person and where they're coming from, and figure out how best to communicate with each other one-on-one, so that hopefully we can all get through this together and be able to have those live shows again, where all of our fans from both sides of the political spectrum of all ages can come to the show and be safe.
Well, I am so excited that you guys took some time out of your busy schedules trying to save the world to join us for this MisInfo MegaCast. I thought, Jess, if you'd like to have say a few final thoughts, we'll just kind of go around.
Sure. And apologies in advance for any background noise. It's a busy time in my household. I will be brief. The silver lining of this terrible pandemic, there are a couple of things. One, I'm hoping that there's emphasis on public health and on prevention, so that we're better prepared for when the next crisis inevitably hits. But two is that it's given birth to platforms like ours. I mean, when before this have folks had access to data scientists and immunologists and epidemiologists? I mean, that's kind of cool, right? And I guess I'd want to remind folks who are on here, because it really is troubling to read some of these comments. And I guess people forget that we are people, and we studied for years not to flash our letters after our names, but because we care about people and we want we want to do good by population health and improve population health. And so when I see these criticisms, we just get lumped in. That's really frustrating. And I would remind people that you're demonizing us, but realize that the people who I think you are praising as heroes, their pockets are getting lined. I know we've talked about so much of this here, but think about that. And also, please don't fall victim to this death of expertise. Again, I hate this concept of, weaponizing credentials, but we are experts in our fields. We did study, we did train, and it's almost like I feel like we were meant for this moment. This is our time to step up, and we just have the public health's best interest at heart. So please don't just dismiss us right off the bat. Listen to what we have to say. Check out our pod. This is not a shameless plug. I mean, we really do have all of our sources listed. You could fact check us. We're not here for anything other than to spread scientific data and fact. And with that, if I do have to drop, thank you all. Thank you so much for inviting us. Thank you, Nisi.
I'll see you later.
See you.
And Andrea, any final thoughts you'd like to give our audience?
I mean, I obviously echo a lot of the sentiments. I think we are living in this kind of new era, this infodemic, and I think navigating it is going to take, a lot of tactics and a lot of skill sets. I don't think any of us imagined that we were going to have to be graphic designers, when the pandemic started. So, I've been learning that on the fly. But I think, I think it's really a testament to all of us who've really stepped up and tried to fill this void where kind of the national and global health agencies have kind of been lacking. And it's kind of unfortunate that we're at that point, but there are resources out there that do provide credible information. We don't have ulterior motives. We try and remind people and remind them that we are just regular people trying to do this because we feel this obligation, this responsibility to kind of cut through the noise. And we're going to keep doing it, even if the trolls come for us. And, that's kind of our current mission. And, it can be a little daunting to try and figure out what we're going to tackle next. But I have to say one of the silver linings is really finding this community among scientists and clinicians and just everybody who's really out there trying to dispel the noise at this point. So,
yeah, that's also what I'm most grateful for, is just meeting all of you. What about you, Charles?
I'll just briefly echo what we've already discussed. But I think one of the things that we can consider in these times is that science, both bench science and social science, are now being discussed broadly, right? And while that means that there's opportunities for mis and mal and disinformation, we are on people's minds and in people's hearts in large part because it's affecting their lives. And I think for many folks that I know, and me included, I got into this work to try to affect people's lives and get people's attention. And now we have it. So we should think about how we communicate with each other. We should think about how we communicate with our participants if we're working directly on primary data collection, how we communicate with our diverse networks to really understand how we can do a better job of communicating information and communicating that we often don't know. That's part of what research is about. If we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't call it research. So we are trying to explore and find answers to questions. And we do argue and we do debate on methodology and we do debate on interpreting findings. And we're constantly debating on what truth is and how we can more precisely refine what we're learning about the phenomenon that we're studying in the world around us. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to not just communicate what we know. We've always been comfortable doing that, but also communicating what we don't know and communicating that we don't know yet. And yet is a very powerful word I found in my interactions with others who ask me questions about evolving truths. And I always say, well, what is truth really? Not to get too philosophical, but we're always debating and we're constantly evolving. And that doesn't mean that everything we're coming up with or that we're discovering is false. It just means we're still trying to get our head and hearts around it. And we're not quite sure yet, but this is what the evidence suggests. And that's all we can really firmly kind of communicate. And I think that for the people who haven't been trained in science or not as interested in it, I think it's okay if we can communicate better what we do know, but also, more importantly, what we don't know. And I think we can use these times to meet people where they are and close some of that chasm between the scientists, the people that sit off somewhere with their fancy words and their big syllables, and the people that we're trying to serve and actually impact. And then last, I think we can use these spaces, like you had said, Nisi, to really support each other. And I've heard today, and I've heard too many times where some of us, and I don't include me in it, get some pretty difficult reactions from what it is that you're doing. And I empathize with that. I think that this is a time where we scientists can do more to be more humane with each other in the world around us, which isn't something that we scientists, be it social or bench scientists, were known for. So we can use these times to work on that and work on ourselves to, again, meet people where they are, do more listening than talking, and understand that we all don't evolve at the same pace. I wasn't first in line to get vaccinated because, frankly, I had to get comfortable with it as well. But once we get to that place, it's really easy to not remember that those times when we weren't so sure about what the science was and wasn't.
And I guess I want to go to Gangstagrass last, but before I do that, I'll just show this comment, which I guess I should have read the name before I posted it because I can't see it now, but she says, "So stoked. I stumbled upon this band a few years ago, pre-pandemic, and to see this has been their response to this crisis is dope AF, great music, and great common sense." Thank you, person whose name I can't read. But Sleeves, what are your parting comments for the audience?
I want to really thank all the fans who have come out toward the end of this comments section to bring back my faith in everybody. We really appreciate it. A lot of times the people who are supporting you are quiet. A lot of times it's the loudest voice in the room that's making trouble, but 99% of the people in the room are right there with you. They're just not that guy who's yelling about it. And that's something that we probably all need to keep in mind. And I would also just like to give a huge shout out to Dr. Nisi Hudson and the Hood Medicine Initiative, Dolio on the board. I mean, you guys have done amazing work throughout the pandemic, not just getting graphics out on my Instagram, which I absolutely love. For sure, follow them on the Instagram. It's so good, but also just making connections to the communities that need those connections and that need that information, and creating these live streams to get information out to all sorts of different audiences. And it's such a huge and wonderful collection of work that you guys have been doing, and I'm so excited to see what you do next. I hope that we'll get to spread the word about the Hood Medicine Initiative at our shows. Dolio is almost always wearing a Hood Medicine Initiative t-shirt, and gangstagrass.com/tour, you can figure out where we're going to be and come to the shows. We're doing everything we can to make them as safe as possible. Check the fit of your mask, get your vaccination card ready. There it is right there on your screen. We're coming to all of those places. We'll be in the UK in June. We're coming to all the places we haven't come to in the spring, in the fall. So we would love to see you. As I say, check the fit of your mask, get your vaccination card ready, and come on out and have a great party and make connections with those people that you might not have otherwise had a connection with. What do you think, Dolio?
Yeah.
Compassion. Everyone, I want everyone to take care of themselves, take care of your families. If you're still skeptical about vaccines in general, at least take care of yourselves, protect yourselves. I don't want anybody to get this if they don't have to. So yeah, all we got is us.
Hey, that's one of That is one of our mottos on our amazing t-shirts from our Bonfire store, which you can check out at bonfire.com/store/gorilla gear. Check that out. That's one way to support us. At Hood Medicine, we like to bring you real talk and mad science. You can find us at hoodmedicine.org, follow us on social, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or you can also support us by making us your Amazon Smile charity. You shop and they donate on your behalf. So thank you again, everyone. Stay safe and get vaccinated. Save the hood. We'll see you on the flip side. Bye, everyone.